In this episode, we're going to talk about endpoint hardening in a way that helps you feel confident rather than overwhelmed, because hardening is often described as a huge list of settings and checkboxes with no clear story tying it together. At a high level, hardening is the process of making an endpoint less easy to compromise and less useful to an attacker if it does get compromised. That involves reducing unnecessary features, keeping software current, and ensuring important security settings stay the way you intended them to stay. Baselines, patch discipline, and configuration integrity are three concepts that anchor hardening in real-world practice, and they work together like a tripod. Baselines tell you what the endpoint should look like. Patch discipline keeps known weaknesses from lingering, and configuration integrity helps you detect and prevent drift away from the intended secure state. When you understand these ideas as an integrated approach, hardening stops feeling like random chores and starts feeling like a coherent security strategy. A baseline is essentially a defined starting point for how an endpoint should be configured in a secure and usable way. Instead of treating every device as a unique snowflake that is set up differently depending on who touched it last, a baseline creates consistency across a fleet of endpoints. Consistency matters because security is harder when everything is different, as attackers can target the weakest variations and defenders struggle to know what normal looks like. A baseline usually includes things like which services are enabled, what security controls are turned on, how accounts and permissions are configured, and how logging is set. For beginners, it helps to think of a baseline as a recipe. If you follow the recipe, you get a predictable result, and if the result is predictable, you can protect it more reliably. The recipe also makes troubleshooting easier, because you can compare a device against the baseline and quickly see what changed. Baselines are not only technical, they are operational discipline, because they reduce surprise. Baselines also help prevent a common beginner trap, which is hardening based on fear rather than based on an intended design. When people harden without a baseline, they often make ad hoc changes that feel secure, like disabling things randomly, but those changes can break workflows and lead to exceptions that weaken security overall. A baseline allows you to choose a secure configuration that still supports real work, and then apply it consistently. It also allows you to differentiate between different endpoint roles, such as user workstations versus servers, because the secure configuration for each role can be different. A workstation might need web browsing and email functions, while a server might not, and the baseline should reflect that difference. Another key point is that baselines are living documents in practice. Because the environment changes, software evolves, and threats evolve. So hardening with confidence means starting from a baseline that is reviewed and updated rather than a baseline that is treated as a permanent artifact. The baseline gives you a stable foundation, not a rigid prison. Patch discipline is the next major pillar, and it's worth emphasizing that patching is not merely about being up to date. It is about reducing known, documented risk. Most major compromises rely on weaknesses that were known before the attack occurred, which means patching is often the difference between a hard target and an easy one. Attackers routinely scan for common vulnerabilities because many organizations delay patching or miss patches altogether. Patch discipline means you have a predictable process for identifying what needs to be updated, scheduling updates, testing where appropriate, and ensuring updates actually get applied. It also means you treat patching as a continuous routine rather than an occasional project. For beginners, the simplest way to think about patching is that it removes doors that attackers already know how to open. Leaving those doors unpatched is like leaving an old lock on a front door while criminals carry the key. The reason patching can feel hard is that it competes with uptime, compatibility, and human attention. People fear that patches will break applications, disrupt workflows, or cause outages, and those fears are not imaginary. Patch discipline does not mean patch without thinking. It means manage patching as a controlled risk trade-off. That includes testing patches on representative systems, staging rollouts, and communicating changes so that users and administrators are not surprised. It also includes recognizing that delaying patches has a cost too, and that cost often grows quickly when vulnerabilities are publicly discussed. In practice, discipline often involves prioritization, where the most critical patches for high-risk systems are applied faster than lower-risk updates. The key beginner lesson is that patching is not a technical detail. It is a core security process that must be planned and resourced. Organizations that treat patching as optional tend to accumulate known vulnerabilities faster than they can track them. Configuration integrity is the third pillar, and it's where hardening becomes durable instead of fragile. Even if you start with a good baseline and apply patches on time, endpoints can drift away from the intended secure configuration over weeks and months. Drift can happen because users install software, administrators make troubleshooting changes, new policies are applied inconsistently, or attackers deliberately modify settings to weaken defenses. Configuration integrity is about ensuring the endpoint stays close to its baseline, and when it doesn't, you can detect the deviation and restore the intended configuration. This includes monitoring for changes to key settings, checking file and policy integrity, and maintaining the ability to enforce configuration centrally. From a beginner viewpoint, integrity is about keeping the secure recipe intact over time. If a baseline is the recipe, configuration integrity is checking that the ingredients and steps haven't been swapped quietly after the fact. A powerful reason to care about configuration integrity is that attackers often seek persistence, meaning they try to make their access survive reboots and remain hidden. Persistence frequently involves changing configurations, such as creating new startup behaviors, altering security settings, or modifying access permissions. If you can detect and prevent unauthorized configuration changes, you can disrupt persistence attempts early. Even when an attacker does not succeed fully, the attempt itself can be a valuable detection signal. Configuration integrity also matters for compliance and audit readiness, but the security reason is more immediate. A device that drifts unpredictably is difficult to defend because defenders cannot rely on its controls. When settings drift, the environment becomes uneven, and attackers exploit unevenness. Integrity mechanisms aim to reduce unevenness so that every endpoint maintains a consistent defensive posture. That consistency turns a large fleet of devices into something that can be protected systematically. Hardening with confidence also includes reducing attack surface, which means disabling or removing features and services that are not needed. Every enabled service is a potential target, and every installed application is a potential vulnerability. Beginners sometimes think the safest endpoint is one that has everything turned on but protected by antivirus, but defense works better when you remove unnecessary components. This is where baselines shine, because they allow you to decide, in advance, which services and applications are truly required for a role. Reducing attack surface also improves performance and decreases complexity, which helps both security and operations. An endpoint that runs fewer unnecessary services has fewer places for attackers to hide and fewer opportunities for misconfiguration. It also makes monitoring easier because there are fewer legitimate processes to confuse detection logic. The main idea is that it is easier to defend a simpler system than a complex one. Another crucial part of endpoint hardening is managing privileges thoughtfully, because many attacks become serious only after the attacker gains elevated rights. If normal users operate with excessive permissions, a single phishing event can quickly lead to a full system compromise. Hardening, therefore, often includes ensuring that users run as standard users for day-to-day work and that administrative actions require separate elevated steps. This also ties back to management networks and jump hosts, because administrative access should be controlled and monitored. For beginners, it's enough to understand that privilege is power and attackers seek power because it makes everything else easier. Reducing unnecessary privilege reduces the damage a compromised account can do. It also reduces the attacker's ability to disable endpoint protections, because many security controls require elevated rights to alter. So privilege management is a form of configuration integrity. It makes it harder for both users and attackers to change the system in ways that weaken defenses. Hardening also depends on visibility, because you cannot maintain integrity if you cannot tell what changed. That means ensuring logging is enabled, that key security events are recorded, and that logs are forwarded centrally so they cannot be erased easily. It also means monitoring for baseline deviations and responding to them in a structured way. Some deviations are benign, like a legitimate software update, while others are suspicious, like security controls being turned off or new services appearing unexpectedly. A confident hardening program treats these deviations as actionable signals rather than as annoying anomalies. It also includes a process for handling legitimate exceptions, because some endpoints will need special software or settings, and those exceptions should be approved and documented rather than ad hoc. Otherwise, exceptions become drift, and drift becomes vulnerability. The goal is not to eliminate change. It is to make change deliberate and visible. As we conclude, the main story is that endpoint hardening becomes manageable when you anchor it in baselines, patch discipline, and configuration integrity. Baselines provide a consistent, secure starting point so devices are predictable and defensible across a fleet. Patch discipline reduces known vulnerabilities that attackers routinely exploit, turning patching into a planned security routine rather than a chaotic scramble. Configuration integrity keeps endpoints from drifting away from secure settings and helps detect unauthorized changes that often signal persistence attempts or weakening of defenses. These pillars reinforce each other, because a baseline without patches becomes outdated, patches without baseline create inconsistency, and both without integrity drift into chaos. When you approach hardening as a coherent system rather than a checklist, you can make endpoints both safer and easier to manage. That confidence comes from clarity. You know what the endpoint should be, you keep it current, and you verify it stays that way over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.